Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson, and this is the Erickson Report. And we're actually going to start with some good news from a part of the world that I don't pay enough attention to. In fact, I think most of us don't, which is Latin America. On August 7th, Gustavo Petro, a former member of Colombia's M19 guerrilla group, was sworn into office as his nation's first leftist president, having won an election on promises to fight inequality and bring peace to a country long ripped apart by guerrilla violence. He beat conservative parties that proposed to tweak the country's market-dominated economy, but failed to connect with voters, frustrated by rising poverty and violence against human rights and environmental groups. Petro called his victory a second chance for Colombia to address those sorts of issues and promised to tackle them while maintaining solidarity with the nation's poor and oppressed. It'll be interesting to see how long it is before he starts getting the Hugo Chavez treatment, where every move opposed by the elites in the business community gets labeled as authoritarian and a drive for dictatorship. Now, on a clearly related note here, Brazil's presidential election is on October 2nd. And the candidate leading all the polls by an aggregate of 10 points is former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a progressive who during his time in office introduced sweeping social programs to reduce poverty and to raise the station of the working class from which he came. The incumbent is Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right wacko with plunging popularity, and frankly, I don't have enough time to tell you all the good things he's against and all the bad things he's for, but suffice it to say that he gained international notoriety during the COVID pandemic by labeling it a fantasy created by the media, even as Brazil was having one of the world's highest death rates. So it seems October 2nd is like coming good news. But of course, these days, little good news goes unsullied. In July, Bolsonaro, who has made unsubstantiated claims that the Brazilian electoral system is completely vulnerable to fraud, hinted that he may refuse to accept the results of the election if he loses. In response, over 800,000 Brazilians have signed a manifesto calling for those results to be respected, whatever they are. And more to the point, Brazil seems more devoted to preventing that kind of coup than officials in the U.S. are. On August 23rd, Brazilian police searched the homes of several prominent businessmen associated with Bolsonaro because the Supreme Court, which actually heads up the nation's election authority, issued search and seizure warrants in a probe alleging the men took part in a private chat group where they discussed a possible power grab in the event Bolsonaro loses. Some accounts describe these discussions as speculative and not any proof of any kind of coordinated plot. But when you have comments like, "I prefer a coup to the return of the Workers' Party 1,000,000 times more," with the addendum that if they were to seize power, the rest of the world wouldn't care. Another looking forward to a large military parade on September 7th saying, "I want to see if the Supreme Court has the courage to rig the election," after a military parade with the troops applauded by the public, with someone else echoing that the parade will make it clear which side the army stands on. Yeah, I think you have cause to worry. Under the heading of being thankful for small favors, another part of the world we don't pay enough attention to, this being Asia, Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong announced on August 21st that his government will repeal Section 377A of the Penal Code, a law dating from the era of British colonial rule, which made sex between men punishable by 2 years in prison. More than 20 LGBTQ+ groups in Singapore said the repeal was long overdue, and to show that state-sanctioned discrimination has no place in Singapore, while also noting this is merely the first step in a long road. Now, which is good. That's good. And it undoubtedly seemed like a good thing for Lee to be doing. The PR is good. Certainly the optics of this are good. Except in 2007, Parliament decided to keep the law but not enforce it. So what Lee is promising to do here is to repeal a law which has not been enforced for 15 years and wasn't going to be. Symbolism at its purest. What's more, at the same time as this, Lee also said the government is going to amend the Constitution to safeguard the institution of marriage, to prevent any constitutional challenges that would allow same-sex unions. And at the same time as this announcement, religious groups immediately started raising the specter of reverse discrimination if this law is repealed. Reverse discrimination, of course, being the idea that if anybody else gets human rights, you are being thereby oppressed. Still, even symbolism has its value, and change has been coming to Asia. India's top court decriminalized gay sex in 2018. Taiwan allowed for same-sex marriage in 2019. And Thailand recently approved moves to establish same-sex unions. As National University of Singapore sociologist Tan Earn Sir said, on the surface, this may seem like one step forward, two steps backward. But he suggested the repeal could be seen as a foot in the door, which could pave the way to future challenges. Now, it's true that, in fact, it wouldn't be the first time that change has come about just that way. The thin edge of the wedge does not have to lead to bad consequences. All right, and one more bit of good news here. There are these outfits called crisis pregnancy centers. You may well have heard of them, but just in case you haven't, they present themselves as offering advice and assistance with the intention of tricking people into thinking that they offer abortion services or referrals. But once they lure people in, that person is heavily pressured, often with emotional manipulation and lies about abortion, into continuing the pregnancy. Online search engines and advertising are one of the key ways they try to get people in the door. But now the customer review platform Yelp is taking a step to crack down on the deception by adding a consumer notice to crisis pregnancy center listings, saying these outfits, quote, provide limited medical services and may not have licensed medical professionals on site. Now, Yelp had already decided back in 2018 that crisis pregnancy centers would be listed entirely separate from places that actually offer abortion services. Now, the thing is, of course, this notice does not address all the problems with these places, but at least it does clearly indicate, warning, are you sure that this is what you want? Other customer review platforms should follow suit, as should ad-driven outfits like Google and Facebook. There's been some move in that direction, admittedly, but not enough, because as Laura Clausen of Daily Kos said, if crisis pregnancy centers can't do their job without lying, then they shouldn't be allowed to do it. All right, next up, moving to a different topic, a few notes about the economy. One clearly known outcome of the COVID pandemic, and a significant factor in inflation, which, by the way, is a world phenomenon, not just a U.S. one, and I expect it would be politically advantageous to some people to keep noticing that fact. Anyway, one known outcome was a significant disruption of world supply chains. One result of that, however, in turn, has been that American companies are on pace to reshore nearly 350,000 jobs this year. That is, to bring back to the U.S. jobs that had previously been shipped abroad. That's according to a report published August 19th by the Reshoring Initiative, a group that lobbies for reshoring manufacturing jobs. That 350,000 would be the highest number since the group began tracking the data in 2010. Personally, by the way, I also wonder if these years have also caused some companies to reconsider the just-in-time model. The idea of that is to save money by reducing costs related to storage and maintaining inventory. The idea is you just have just what you need and you get it just when you need it, which is all well and good, of course, but it does make you extra vulnerable to any disruptions in your supply chain. All right, next up, under the heading of we knew it all along, another significant driver of inflation is flat-out corporate greed. On August 10th, Accountable.us released its updated and conclusive report on big oil's massive second quarter earnings, showing that the 28 largest fossil fuel companies, oil companies I should be more specific, 28 largest oil companies made a record-breaking $90 billion in profits in the first quarter of 2022, a 183% increase over the same quarter the year before. Oil executives even boasted about the profits. Contera's CEO described an embarrassment of riches, and Halliburton's CEO went so far as to brag that customers will expect and accept high gas prices. Expect to be screwed by big business? Yeah, I think we kind of do, yeah. But if you're still not sure about that, consider this. The so-called CHIPS and Science Act provides $52 billion in taxpayer subsidies and $24 billion investment tax credit. That's $76 billion in public support for the semiconductor industry with the idea of increasing chip production and thus jobs in the United States. The day this bill was signed into law, Intel announced it's going to cut $4 billion from its expansion plans while simultaneously increasing dividends to shareholders. The next day, Micron said that it plans to cut its capital spending significantly next year while vowing to make good use of the law's grants and credits. And finally here, it's 5 p.m. or whenever. It's the end of your shift, the end of your day, okay, whenever. But you're not quite finished doing something, but hey, it can wait till tomorrow. So you close up or close out and head out. According to some employers, you're not leaving for the day. You're quiet quitting. That is, you're doing your job, but you're failing to go beyond the requirements. You're failing to go above and beyond. Failing, that is, to work for free. The very fact that a concept like quiet quitting even exists shows how companies routinely exploit their employees' labor and how these businesses benefit from a culture of overwork without additional pay or other compensation. It appears to some, in fact, that another result, in fact, I'll call it a benefit of the pandemic, is that some workers are beginning to just not put up with that. And good on them. And we're taking a break. And we are back. And we are back with the triumphant return of 2 weeks of stupid clowns and outrages. And we start, as we always do, with the clowns. Jake Tapper had an interview with Maxwell Frost, the Democratic nominee for Congress in Florida's 10th Congressional District. Frost, who was 25 and thereby a member of Generation Z, is the favorite now to win election in the heavily blue district. In the interview, Frost argued for greater diversity in Congress, including diversity of age, and suggested Gen Z has been unfairly maligned. All of which led up to this. Tapper's response to that was to say, quoting, "I don't blame Generation Z. Let me give you a secret. It's all the fault of the boomers. They ruined everything. Take it from a member of Generation X." Well, the song says that every generation blames the one before, so I suppose it's our turn. But that doesn't make Jake Tapper, who along with his corporate bosses at CNN is trying so hard to pivot to the center that they look as screwy as they are, it doesn't make him any less of a clown. All right, our next clown is the Mystic Valley Regional Charter School in Malden, Massachusetts, where on August 18th, an 8th grade student was written up for violating school uniform rules for wearing a hijab, a notice given by a teacher so clueless that they called it a jihab, which could, emphasize could, have been passed by if the school administration didn't follow up by saying its handling of the situation came across as insensitive. Came across as? What's this, the new version of I'm sorry you took it that way? The latest way to dodge responsibility for what you say or do by chalking it up to someone else's failure to understand your meaning? It didn't come across as insensitive. It was insensitive. The fact that the school declares that students can wear religious attire as an expression of their sincerely held beliefs, but only if they provide a letter expressing this desire from a member of their clergy, kind of like a conscientious objector test for school clothes, convinces you really, really mean it, that only makes it worse. The same school got in PR trouble in 2017 by banning hair braid extensions, backing off only after a formal complaint from the ACLU and being told by State Attorney General Maura Healey that the policy was illegal because it singled out students of color. The administration of Mystic Valley Regional Charter School. Clowns then, clowns now. Now, next up, I said recently that one of the reasons 2 Weeks of Stupid had been missing from the show's lineup for a while is that there weren't enough clowns around. I mean, they all seemed either too well known, like Dr. Land of Oz or Herschel Walker, or better categorized as outrages rather than clowns, a kind that leave you, instead of leaving you shaking your head in wonder, leave you slack-jawed in shock. So in desperation, I've created a new category, evil clown. Thus, this. The Gopper nominee for governor of Michigan is one Tudor Dixon, who is everything you'd expect from a Gopper candidate. Early in August, he expressed opposition to a proposed state constitutional amendment guaranteeing access to abortion, saying that would create, quote, a safe haven for any type of predator out there. Because, quoting again, if you're a predator, there's nothing you like more than abortion. And if you can get a girl an abortion without her parents knowing, you can keep hurting her. So in other words, according to her, banning all rights to an abortion is actually an anti-predator measure. She followed that up with a recent interview with Fox 2 Detroit, where she was asked about why she's against a 14-year-old rape victim being able to get an abortion. Her response was to say that by forcing this child to carry the pregnancy to term, she'd form a bond with the baby, and that would help her heal from the trauma of rape. Put another way, if you get raped, you should hope that you get pregnant because that will do you better in the long run, even if you are just a child yourself. This is what passes for coherent thought processes on the right. Tudor Dixon, not just a clown, an evil clown. All right, moving on to the outrages. This first one is a real jaw-dropper. The United Mine Workers of America has been on strike for over a year against an Alabama coal company named Warrior Met Coal Mining. Workers have sought improved health benefits. Warrior Met contends it has offered the workers a competitive package. Competitive being boss talk for will underpay you about the same rate as everybody else around. On July 22nd, the National Labor Relations Board ordered the union to pay $13.3 million in compensation to the corporation. Amount apparently based on an agreement the union and the company had made that the union would pay damages for strike misconduct. And the NLRB decided that term includes the company's costs for security. In other words, there's a strike, company wants security. Now the union has to pay for the security. And also the value of the unmined coal. In other words, because of the strike, there was less coal mined, so the company had less coal to sell, therefore it didn't make as much money, and now they're telling that the union has to pay that amount. In other words, the union has to cover any costs or expenses that the company had as a result of the strike, which itself would mark the strike itself as union misconduct. This is insane. International United Mine Workers Union President Cecil Roberts noted this is outrageous and effectively negates workers' right to strike. Which of course it does, because if the union has to cover whatever costs the company has, where is there any power in a strike? The union tends to fight that judgment, and damn right. Oh, as a footnote to this, despite the strike, Warrior Met reported net income of $146 million in the first quarter of 2022. All right, next up, back in November, I reported that the Israeli government had labeled 6 Palestinian civil and human rights groups working in the West Bank as terrorist organizations, based entirely on a still unsubstantiated claim that the 6 were secretly controlled by the militant Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That move has been denounced and rejected by a large number of human rights groups, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN Human Rights Office in Ramallah, 21 Israel-based civil organizations, 9 member states of the European Union, and even the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz. And in the wake of this designation of these 6 groups, over 300 U.S.-based social justice, civil rights, and human rights groups signed a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken demanding he immediately and unequivocally condemn the action. Because bluntly, the only voice in this that really would have mattered was that of the United States. And the United States stood silent. And now we see the predictable results of such silence. On August 18th, Israeli military forces raided the offices of the 6 groups, in at least one case, literally blasting their way through locked doors. They seized property, then sealed up the offices and declared them closed. As expressed by the Center for Constitutional Rights, I'm quoting them here, having failed to cut off international support with unsubstantiated terrorist smears, and having failed to halt the critical work of the 6 organizations, Israel, as a belligerent occupying power, has sought to physically block their operations. But CCR's money quote came after. Such an escalation would not have been possible had the Biden administration been forceful in its rebuke of Israel's assault on human rights, either when it first designated the groups as terrorist organizations or any time since. Israel is an occupying power, standing in violation of human rights and international law. There is no reason to expect that to change in any way except to get worse, so long as the only voice with the power to be a counterweight continues to not only stand silent, but to actively aid and abet continuation of the oppression to the tune of $3.8 billion in military aid every single year. And I would remind you that aiding and abetting a crime is itself a crime and an outrage. There are 2 footnotes to this. First, in May, I talked about the killing of American-Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. And now eyewitness accounts said Israeli soldiers were to blame. Since then, multiple investigations have come to that same conclusion, that she was killed by an Israeli sniper. This is another case where the U.S. has stood silent. That is, except for a truly mealy-mouthed and very brief statement from the State Department saying, in effect, who knows what happened, and mumbling about tragic circumstances. Now, more than 100 days later, during which time her family was snubbed by Biden during his visit to the Middle East and given non-answers by Blinken after the family traveled to Washington, that silence continues. No response, no accountability. Just that deadly silence, persisting even in the face of calls from members of Congress, including 57 members of the House and 23 in the Senate, for U.S. officials to launch an investigation. Which is why Shireen Abu Akleh was in fact not the first journalist to be murdered by the Israeli military, nor will she be the last. And finally, footnote 2. If you'd like to do something to take your own stand, maybe even say that I'm just going to boycott Israel until they change their ways, be very careful. On June 22nd, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld an Arkansas law requiring state contractors to reduce their fees by 20% if they refuse to sign a pledge saying they won't support the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, that is the BDS movement, one intended to bring economic pressure on Israel to change policies regarding the occupied territories. The majority opinion here of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals held that economic decisions that discriminate against Israel are not inherently expressive and do not implicate the First Amendment. First of all, discriminate against Israel. How do you have a boycott that doesn't have a target? By that definition, any boycott is discriminatory. But I'm sorry, economic boycotts for specific political purposes are not inherently expressive? What the hell are you talking about? In other words, it was properly described as a frightening and shocking decision. The court approved a state government using its economic power to penalize private businesses based on their political position regarding Israel and Palestine. And if that does not frighten and shock you, you really need to rethink your commitment to free speech. All right, finally for this time. A reminder, I'm going to do this from time to time. It's a reminder of something we must never forget. A new poll, this one from the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and the Associated Press Nork Center for Public Affairs Research, shows what pretty much every previous poll on the topic has shown. Most U.S. adults, 71% in this case, want to see gun laws made stricter, a figure that includes about half of Republicans and a majority of gun-owning households. Bipartisan majorities here support universal background checks, support allowing courts to temporarily prevent people considered a danger to themselves or others from being able to buy a gun, making 21 a minimum age nationwide to buy a gun, and banning those who have been convicted of domestic violence from being able to buy a gun. Meanwhile, nearly 60%, including a third of Goppers, favor a ban on semi-automatic weapons. And an overwhelming majority, including a plurality of Goppers, oppose laws that allow people to carry a gun in public without a permit. One perpetually troubling finding, however, in this, it always comes up and it's always the same, and to me it's very troubling, but it's a finding that a bipartisan majority also favor banning mentally ill people from purchasing guns, which embraces the gun industry evasion that gun violence is a mental health issue instead of anything to do with the guns, and continuing the tradition of demonizing those with mental illness. That finding, in fact, only underlined a part of that gun bill that was passed to such fanfare in June, the biggest investment in which is in money for mental health programs, as if that was a central issue in gun violence, even though the absolute fact is that mentally troubled people are no more likely to actually commit violence than we normal people are. Now, in fairness, that same legislation I just cited, fairly called the most sweeping gun violence bill in nearly 30 years, which only shows how screwed up we are on the topic, it did take a few steps toward tightening some of those proposed restrictions, what is to the good. But it did it at the cost of doing nothing about what could be called the big ticket items, the big agenda items, such as banning semi-automatic weapons, banning large capacity magazines, and universal background checks. I'm going to end up now with this because it's something that, again, I'm going to just remind you of from time to time. Since Uvalde, this is as of August 24th, in the 140 days since Uvalde, there have been 216 mass shootings in the United States. Mass shooting defined as at least 4 people wounded or killed in a single incident, not counting the shooter. 216 incidents in 140 days, that's 11 a week, leaving 187 dead, 919 wounded since Uvalde. And remember, this is just a small part of the ongoing, grinding bloodshed produced by guns in the United States. Guns that remain too many damn guns, too damn easy to get. That's it. We're done. I'm out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. Peace.